I learned how to write. I learned how to articulate. I learned how to analyze. I learned how to be a team player. I learned how to manage my time. I learned how to be accountable and responsible through this civic educational process. And what I also did was got exposed to a field that I'm not sure, at least at that period in my life, I would have been exposed to. So the way some mock trial teams work is they get an attorney from the community that also assists the teacher in teaching and coaching those schools. And so the attorney that uh, coached my team, he and I developed a relationship in which he became a mentor for me through high school. And then I came back, he helped me to come back to that very law firm. And while I was in college, and I worked there as a messenger. And then when I went to law school, he was helping me and mentoring me then, and brought me back during law school and said, hey, we have a paralegal position here while you're on break in law school or doing your semesters. Why don't you come and work at our law firm as a paralegal? I did that. And then ultimately, after I was working at Consumers Energy as an attorney and passed the bar, that very same law firm recruited me back to Kalamazoo, where I became a an associate at their firm. And that very same law firm, I ultimately ended up making partner and becoming a partner of that law firm. And so it just opened up this whole world of experience for me. What I ultimately ended up realizing is that civic education is so important that it really deserves as much attention from our society as we can give it. So I came back when I was in Kalamazoo. I coached that very same mock trial team that I was on when I was in high school. And then ultimately, when the opportunity came up, I became the coordinator for the overall high school mock trial tournaments. And I'm currently the coordinator for the tournaments because I believe that strongly, that civic education can be this pathway to greater platforms for our students, both intellectually, socially, emotionally, as well as in a career path. So for me, it was a very wonderful path to take. I'm still on this journey. I often say the civic education is the gift that keeps on giving because it continues to impact my life. I continue to learn from the people, the students, the organizations that support the programs. And so I also add that, Michigan Center for Civic Education has been doing these types of programs, and particularly mock trial, for over 30 decades. So we've got 30 decades of students who have been impacted by this wonderful organization. So for me, it's been a wonderful pathway. It's been a wonderful platform to allow me to have success in my career, in my life. And certainly I believe that everyone would benefit from it. So I appreciate the opportunity to kind of show you that pathway for me that was started really with civic education and has blossomed into what it is right now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Attorney Liggins, for sharing your story. And I must say myself, I grew up in a small town in Southwest Florida, and I wish I had this resource available to me. So it's great to see that you're walking in your success and to see that you're still involved and giving back in different ways. And I do have some follow-up questions for you at the end because your story is pretty remarkable.
Thank you.
I was making notes the entire time. So our next speaker is also very involved in the community and changing lives through education. We welcome Dr. Amber Benton. Dr. Benton is a fellow Spartan, and so is Attorney Liggins. So her resume is also very impressive. She's an educator, a scholar, a practitioner that focuses on inclusion and equity practices in higher education. She earned a Bachelor of Arts in Spanish from Pacific University, a Master of Education in Educational Leadership from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and a Doctor of Philosophy in Higher Adult and Lifelong Education from Michigan State University. She currently serves as the Director of diversity programming and student engagement in the James Madison College, which is a very prestigious college, by the way. A lot of reading. She is also the founder of MSU Women of Color Community and the university-wide annual Social Justice Art Festival. I'm very excited to hear from you and how you're changing lives in our community. And with that being said, we welcome her this evening.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And so I'm going to actually share my screen with all of you. My presentation tonight is not necessarily a personal story, but since it's Black History Month, I also want to challenge us to think about who are hidden figures in our society. As mentioned, I come from an equity background, and so I think it's important that we think about folks at intersections and at margins. And so I'll just do my brief presentation with you all here. Hopefully everyone can see the slides. Yes, it's always the fear that you share, no one can see it. So just the title of my presentation is Invisibility, Hidden Figures in Our Society. Once again, I'm Dr. Amber Benton. I use she, her pronouns. And so when I think about invisibility, I'm actually talking about social invisibility, which is the absence of marginalized groups from media, policies, procedures, legislation, social activities, and other milieus, which reinforce the notion, conscious or unconscious, that dominant groups are the norm. When we have invisibility, it contributes to disempowerment of marginalized groups, and it perpetuates a cycle of oppression. And so how can we think about who is actually on the margins and who's actually invisible in our society? And I created a little short graphic here for you all, but invisibility leads to marginalization, but marginalization also leads to invisibility. So they're also both connected. So I might disorient some of you, but we're gonna start on the right side. And so I want you to think about thinking about race, thinking about people of color and all the race and ethnicities within that. And then once you add in gender, so thinking about women, gender non-binary, men who are also people of color. And then from there, thinking about all those other identities. So if you're a person of color, you might identify as a woman, a man, gender non-conforming, and then we add in your income level, or we add in a disability, or we think about your age or your sexual identity that may further lead to how society invisibilizes you. So I'm just going to share a couple of little quick snips of folks that we often make invisible in our society. So here on your screen, you see Jessamine Stanley, who's a yoga teacher and body positivity advocate. It's very rare that you will see, particularly a Black woman who is plus size in mainstream media. However, it's very ironic because the National Center for Health Statistics tell us that the average adult man is about 200 pounds and the average adult woman is around 171 pounds. Yet average size of runway and fashion models are about 5'9", and based on those measurements, that would create a very tall and thin person. Even plus size models start at a size 12, which is still relatively small considering average height and weight in our society. Another invisibility issue that we have in our society is homeless LGBTQ youth. Youth who identify as LGBTQ are more at risk of being homeless. There's 4.2 million youth a year who end up being homeless, but then when you add on youth who identify as LGBTQ, they're 120% more likely to experience homelessness. And then when you add in race, so looking at LGBTQ youth of color, they're often criminalized, particularly in K through 12. They're more likely to be put in our criminal system very early on. And that also leads them to having high rates of homelessness at disproportionate rates. Another invisibility issue is disability in the Black community. Right here, you'll see Lauren Lolo Spencer, who's a disability lifestyle influencer. And so that is not very common. If you look at your Instagram feed, how often do you see a Black woman with a disability grazing your feed or even on your television? However, 1 in 4 or 26% of adults living in the US have some type of disability. 1 in 4 women have a disability, and the most common type is mobility. Moving on to the famous hashtag Say Her Name, Black trans women. Once again, another group that we make invisible in our society. On your screen here, you see Nina Pop, who's a transgender Black woman from Missouri. And according to the Human Rights Campaign, going back to Nina Pop, she was actually murdered this past year. But according to the Human Rights Campaign, there were actually at least 44 transgender or non-conforming folks who were murdered by violent means. Majority of those are often Black trans women and Latina trans women. But according to HRC, it's been the worst in 2020. Another issue is our women in the C-suite. So when we think about who actually makes up the C-suite in corporate America, on your screen here, you see Roz Brewer, who's the current Chief Executive Officer or CEO of Walgreens. She was the former Starbucks COO. But actually, it's only about 17 to 20, it's only about 20%, 21%. It grew from 17% of women who are in the C-suite. But when you narrow that down to women of color, we only make up about 3% as of last year. And Roz Brewer, who once again is on your screen, is the only Black woman CEO in the Fortune 500. But there's also ways that we create invisibility in our structures and systems and our policies. And when we think about pay equity, Black women are also underpaid along with other women of color. And so who is paid less than men, as you can see on your screen? Asian women are paid 10% less, but when you go down to Black women, we're paid 38% less. But it even gets worse. Native American, Indigenous women and Latinas and Latinx women are paid 45% less than men. So almost half. And then also tying again to colorism in the workplace. How do we make folks invisible even based on their skin tone? According to a research study, skin tone is more salient and regarded more highly than one's educational background and prior work experience. Their study found that there was a preference by white hiring managers for light-skinned Black men with a bachelor's degree and minimal managerial experience over a dark-skinned Black man with an MBA and past managerial positions. Once again, another policy we can think about is parental leave. How often do we think about our Black fathers and our parental leave and social welfare policies? More often than not, parental leave and social welfare policies disproportionately affect Black fathers and often discriminate Black fathers and LGBTQ folks and adoptive parents. However, the CDC recently did a report and found that Black fathers were the most involved with their children daily compared to other race ethnic groups of other fathers. And that was including fathers who were in the home and those without. Yet we don't really see this much or policies actually helping them. So I do want to close with a couple of examples of how we can actually make folks visible in our society. And so I want to talk about briefly the Crown Act, which is creating a respectful and open world for natural hair. And so many states are enacting the Crown Act, which prohibits race-based hair discrimination, which often more than not disproportionately affects Black people, particularly Black women. And the reason why the Crown Act is so important is because Black women with natural hairstyles are often perceived to be less professional and less competent, and were less likely to be recommended for job interviews than their white counterparts. And so the Crown Act is trying to put in an actual legal entity to actually protect Black women. I also want to point out another example of the first African-American all-women flight crew. This was back in 2009. There has been another recent one, but this was the first under Captain Rochelle Jones' care. Along with her flight crew, they successfully flew and attended an Atlantic Southwest Airlines flight. And then we have Prince George's County Fire Department. They appointed their very first woman fire chief this year, and they also have 8 Black women firefighters within their department. And so this photo went viral really, I wanna say over this summer as well. And so these are just some small ways that we can help create visibility for folks who are raced people and also at different intersections. And so that's my presentation, and happy to answer questions, but I also hope you all will think about how do we make the invisible visible. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Benton, for your presentation and also your work in the community. I love how you shared the examples of how we can get involved to make invisible individuals more visible, because these are things that people, I don't think about every day. You know, you showed a picture of a woman that was plus size, and I don't think people realize that they do experience a lot of discrimination in different spaces. With that being said, we want to turn it back to our theme, essentially. So while the theme of Black History Month draws light to stories and experiences, we know that it's more than just a month. We have to focus not only on diversity, but inclusion. So we see more companies are starting to hire people of color or African Americans, but there's this issue of inclusion as well. We see this in the legal industry, and I'm sure you being at Michigan State, you probably see it as well. So as we transition into my questions, I welcome everyone to send questions in the chat box as well as I'm asking our presenters questions, and keep it an open dialogue. Please feel free to ask any question you may have. So I have my first question for Attorney Liggins. Your story was very inspiring in how you got involved with civic education. And as I mentioned earlier, I grew up in a small town. I'm first generation American. My parents migrated from Haiti. So we didn't really have many resources in my community. And I'm actually first generation college student as well, and attorney. So it's very inspiring to hear and see individuals like yourself in your position. So my question to you is, what kind of encouragement or words of advice do you have for individuals in situations like this? I mean, I know some communities have civic education programs, but what tips do you have, in your opinion, on how these students can be encouraged to meet attorneys or meet judges?
Well, thank you for the question. I would argue that, certainly within the law field, it still feels somewhat like a kind of a closed off profession sometimes. The reason partly is because the way it's taught in a very traditional way. And it feels almost like a fraternity that you have to somehow get past and get through. And I believe that, first of all, our students need to know that they have access and the ability to do these types of jobs, to do these types of positions. I'm going to tell you right now, when I came back to Kalamazoo, the first thing I noticed was that we've got, it's not a huge town, but it's got several hundred attorneys. And of those several hundred attorneys, there were probably about 20 Black attorneys. That was very striking for me. And what I found was, after polling several of those attorneys, Black attorneys, and attorneys of color, we determined that we wanted to change that. And so you've got people in various communities who are committed to changing that dynamic within our industry. The surprising irony of the legal field is that there are consistently many social justice issues that kind of find success through the legal pathway, yet the legal industry is one of the least diverse industries you're going to find. And so you've got, I want the people who are coming after us to know that you've got attorneys, you've got people within the industry who are actively working to change that dynamic. And so the first thing I did, one of the first things we did when I came to Kalamazoo, is we decided we needed to start a minority bar association in Kalamazoo. And so we started that about 11 years ago with the concept of being a support structure and a support network for our current attorneys, but also to be a pipeline of educational support, mentoring support for those who are coming after us in high school, in college, and in law school. And so I would encourage people to seek out those types of organizations that's underlying goal is the support of students and the support of future attorneys of color as well. There are a lot out there, and if there aren't a lot out there, seek out people like myself and others who are willing to give access to our networks and to our resources to make sure that people are connected to these opportunities. So first, stay encouraged. There are people out there that are willing to help. Two, it is not beyond your possibilities. I'll tell you, I didn't realize it was even in the realm of my possibilities when I was going through until I got exposed to it. So I would also say seek out new experiences, seek out new opportunities that are there. Maybe you don't have a mock trial program, but maybe you've got a debate program. Maybe there are some other extra curricular kind of activities that you can seek out yourself. But you do have to be assertive. You do have to be, you have to think higher. You have to think bigger than maybe some of your environments. And that was my situation. And also there are wonderful people out there that want to help. They don't have to be people of color, right? There are the folks that I mentioned. None of them that got me into mock trial, none of them were persons of color. They were all teachers, Caucasian teachers and attorneys that said, hey, we want to support. So don't look at the world as in there's only one demographic that's going to be willing to support your success. It's all around. And I'm always a glasses half full person as opposed to a glasses half empty.
I absolutely agree with that. Definitely find mentorship. It doesn't matter if they're not from your culture or racial group. There are people that want to support you on your journey to becoming whatever it is you want to become. So my next question is for Dr. Benton. Can you share your journey working at Michigan State University, and particularly your experience as an African-American woman, not only in James Madison, but the university as a whole?
Oh, that's interesting. It's an interesting question. I'll give you the short version. So I didn't really think about going into education. I think like most little Black kids growing up, your parents, I was first generation too. So but I think a lot of our families tell us, you know, you need to be a doctor, you need to be a lawyer, you need to be something, you know, really prestigious. And so nobody really talked to me about the possibilities of education. But at the time I was working, I'm from Las Vegas originally. I was working at a rec center and working with a lot of the kids who would come there were low income and foster families. Most of them did not live with their biological parents. They're living with grandparents. Many of them didn't, like, English was not their first language. We had an inclusion initiative at the time. So at the time for us at Parks and Rec, it meant being inclusive to children with disabilities. So I was a rec assistant, had to convert games for children with disabilities. And I was one of the supervisors actually talked to me about going into higher education, going to get my master's. And I was like, I don't want to teach. Like, I just didn't see myself as being a teacher. And she's like, actually, there's a lot you can do with an education degree. She's like, if you really like what you do at the rec center, you could do that. She's like, I think it'd be actually really meaningful for college students. So I applied late, got in on condition because no one I went to a predominantly white college and for undergrad, and nobody was mentoring me. And most of my faculty did not think I was going to go do anything else. I don't think they even thought I was going to graduate. So my letters of recommendation were not great, leaving college. So I was just like, I wasn't thinking about grad school. So UNLV let me in on condition after that first semester. And I really, really loved it. The faculty there were so nice, so supportive. And so I was like, oh, I could think I want to do this long term. So fast forward, I graduated, was looking for work, did a huge search and ended up getting a position at Michigan State to be an advisor. And I really thought all I was going to do was be an advisor. That's all I really wanted, was to be an academic advisor. I would have never guessed I was going to be doing what I'm doing now. But I think all those threads started to connect together from like working at the rec center, seeing a lot of really social justice, is just seeing communities of kids just being forgotten about, like system just completely failing, from education to finding where your meal is going to come from. Some of those kids, if the rec center was not open, there was not food, you know, for them to eat. And then thinking about how now I'm in higher education as a Black woman. Michigan State has more diversity than my undergrad did, but not as much. But it's still a challenging space to navigate. Higher ed was formed for white men, clergymen. It was not really thought about for people of color, nevertheless, women of color, Black women at that. So to be one of, I think 4% now of us have PhDs, you know, nationwide. I feel privileged to have that, but I also feel like I've said before, a social responsibility for the work that I do. But it is a hard space. It's hard to be the diversity director, but also I experience my own issues navigating higher education. But I always have hope. I feel that a lot of things are very different. The conditions my students are going to school, while they're challenging, they aren't what I went through. And so that gives me hope that we are making some progress there. And I think that that's what I try to hold on to. I think there's a lot of people who are committed and a lot of possibility that we can have, but it's not perfect. And I think the last thing I'll say is we have to start disaggregating people's experiences. Sometimes we lump everything in, but I do think focusing on Black women's experiences within education, I think are really important. Many of us are one of a few in our disciplines, and depending on what you do, I'm on the practitioner side, but we also have professors. It can be an isolating experience. And we also need support while we're supporting our students as well.
Great answer. I mean, I attended Michigan State undergrad and law school, and law school is really not that diverse. Michigan State Law School. It's interesting to hear your experience because so many other Black students have the same experience. In fact, my brother, who's 4 years younger than me, he ended up attending Michigan State undergrad, and he went to grad school. But when he graduated last year, he's like, I don't know if I want to stay in the area, because his experience was just, I want to be around, more diversity. But my experience was more so, okay, yeah, there's not that much diversity, but there's some things I can do to navigate through this. So it's really interesting to hear how the both of you had that experience. But there's some questions in the chat box that I would like to ask both of you. So, do you see any tension inherent in DEI initiatives? In other words, my inclusion into existing power structures be in tension with equity initiatives? What are your thoughts on that? Open floor.
Wow. No more softball questions, I guess. That one's that's a layered question. So I'm on several local kind of community boards, and many of us are currently going through diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, kind of assessments. And one of the highlights I will point out with respect to an assessment I just did was this concept of when people say, I don't see color, right? I don't see race. And I think it comes from an interesting place. I think the comment comes from the place of saying, I try not to discriminate based upon certain things. And I think that's at least a well-intentioned place. But to say I don't see color, to say I don't see race, then makes insignificant my own experience that I bring to the value of what I bring to the table based upon my own individual identity, which includes my culture, it includes my every kind of aspect of who I am. So when you make the statement, I don't see race, what you're really saying is I don't see much of what makes you you. And so therein lies the tension for me. The tension is, how do you help organizations to really grapple with the concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion, real diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, which really, I think, says in the core of it is that there is value in the individuality of each person that you come across. But at the same time, tackle the structural, discrimination that comes from a majority, in essence, regardless of whether there's an intent behind it or not, the structures of a lot of our systems are inherently discriminatory. And so if we do not, if we're focused on inclusion, does that somehow fight against the equity aspect of it? And I argue that it is a tension that we all have to continue to grapple with to help us to really have these real, not surface, but deeper conversations about our systems and about ourselves to better understand how to become better in society as a whole. So yeah, there's a tension there, but I also believe that it is a tension that deserves our attention. It's not one in which we should ignore. I think we should delve in head first to really understand and explore it. And when we do, we come to a better sense of what diversity, equity, and inclusion should really mean for our organizations and for ourselves.
Yeah, I'm gonna chime in here. I think if there's, hope we have time. So for me, I'll ground this in thinking about public education in Michigan specifically. I definitely think there's a tension between inclusion and equity, because I think about the fact that Michigan doesn't have affirmative action. And so when you're thinking about equity, you're trying to have equitable policies and practices, particularly to, in simplest terms, to right the wrongs that you've done to marginalized communities. And it's very hard to do that when folks can sue programs that are trying to do that very thing. So I think, so yes, there is a tension. I also want to go back to this idea of inclusion. I think many folks misunderstand the concept of inclusion. I think folks think inclusion means I'm going to pick all the races, all the genders, all the sexual identities, and I've been inclusive. And that's really not what it is. And I go back to when I used to work with the youth with disabilities. It was making sure, one, they had access, but also the goal was to make sure that they felt like every other kid when they came to that place. And that's really what inclusion is. Whatever you bring to the organization, whatever you show up with in school, you feel like you belong. But sometimes we just stop with this idea of, I checked everything off, so it's inclusive, but that doesn't necessarily, that's not what it necessarily means. I'll go and I'll give another example with pay equity. I hear a lot of times we talk about women are not paid the same as men. We're not paid on the dollar, but as I showed in my slide, we need to be really specific about that, because you have Asian women who are actually closer to getting parity with pay equity than Latinas are. Latinas are basically making 50 cents. And so when we think about equity, we do need to be narrowed in, but I think about our policies and what we have, especially for education, it does force us to be very creative and trying to work around policies that are in place. But equity for me should always be the goal. Inclusion is how we feel and how we belong, but we really need to, the only way we're gonna have sustainable change is if we really can work on equity. And so we really need to look at policies that are perpetuating that tension, because they don't necessarily have to be there doesn't have to be this tension. If you're being equitable, you can help people feel more included in a particular organization or particular space.
Great answers. Go ahead, Attorney.
Yeah, I do want to add into that, because thank you, Dr. Benson, for bringing up equity. I have we show this all the time, and you probably have seen it before, but I'm going to share my screen so people can see it. This diagram regarding what equity really, what we're really trying to get at when we're talking equity. At the end of the day, equal is all of those boxes there are the same, and everybody has the same box to get up on. But if equity recognizes that everyone is coming from a different place. And so how do we make sure, like Dr. Benton said, that the ones who, the youngest one who is on that same box that everybody else on that same height, has an ability to still be included in this wonderful game that's taking place. And so really, when we're talking equity, we're not necessarily talking equality. And a lot of times it's hard for people to get their head around with respect to the underlying structures, because if the underlying structures have been discriminatory for their inception, You really have to figure out, well, yeah, you know, a lot of folks say, well, let's just try to take away the feelings of inequality. So let's make sure that this person is paid the same as this person. I'll give you an example. One of the boards that I'm on, we had a conversation about, well, we want to fix pay equity. And so the answer, one of the questions was, well, do we just give everybody the same, you know, pay raise across the board to kind of bring everybody up? And the answer was, well, hold on. What about the people who are already at a certain level? Shouldn't we make sure that we give more to the ones who are clearly experiencing, because of the systems, a lower pay than the ones who are already at a certain level? And ultimately, that was the answer. The answer was in pay, it was, wait a minute, we've got to look at people individually as opposed to just equity, equality rather, across the board. So yeah, I think that this is an interesting conversation, and it can continue. I mean, we could probably talk about equity, equality, inclusion, and diversity probably for the rest of this conversation if we wanted to.
Wow, great answers. I mean, going back to what you all were saying, you know, being treated fairly. And one thing is just to not invalidate someone's experience just because you haven't had that experience, especially in the workplace. Which leads me to my next question in the chat box. How do you navigate microaggressions? Open floor once again.
I can go first. That's okay. I think that navigating, I think, is an interesting word, because I think when they happen, it's not like you're expecting them to happen. It's not like, oh, I have to navigate through this this like race course or track or something. But for me, I think one is folks need to educate themselves about microaggressions, but I also had to educate myself, because a lot of things, we have a lot more language and information now. Things that I was told when I was younger, I did not think that it was microaggressive. I think my professors that I had at undergrad, looking back on many of the things now, I experienced a lot of microaggressions being one of two Black people. You know, I had a recommendation letter that basically said that I dressed nice and I was a upbeat person. It had nothing about my academic skill or my competency to actually do higher level work. And so at the time, I was like, oh, this was really nice. And I was like, actually, this is really gendered and racist when I go back and think about it. But one thing that I do, I think, and learning what they actually are, but actually being able to have conversations with people to let them know about the harm that they're doing. And I know that takes a level of vulnerability and bravery, but I feel like I'm in a position now that I have to let you know when you're doing something that is inappropriate, because I also don't want you going around doing it to somebody else as well. And sometimes I find people aren't aware that they're committing a microaggression, hence why it's a microaggression, that it's something that they haven't really thought about that is affecting people in a particular way. But as much as I hate to say it, microaggressions are part of life. They're not going anywhere, unfortunately. When you are marginalized in school and work, they come up even in nonverbal ways about who invites you to things, what do you get asked to do, what associations and memberships do you have access to. And so my thing is find ways to actually create your own space. And I think that has helped me think about, like, when I created the Women of Color community and I created the art festival, I stopped waiting to be invited to some of these places. I was like, I'm going to go and do what I think is going to serve me and the work that I want to do. And so that would be my advice to anybody, is one, educate yourself so you can let people know about the harm they're doing, but also not waiting. Don't place your hope in people to change. Find the things that are actually going to give you joy and hope and satisfaction in the workplace, because that will do probably carry you much further than waiting for people to change their behavior or to suddenly like make a 180 and become a new person in the workplace. So yeah, I'll leave there.
Well, I don't mind saying that I've got a kind of very ironic microaggression story that I'll share. I don't know if it'll tell you how to navigate, but let me just share it. All right, here's the story. When I first started back here in Kalamazoo as an attorney, I did some criminal defense work. I still do a little bit of criminal defense work now. But so what will happen is every time, it happened at least 4 or 5 times, that I would go into court. And when you normally these hearings, the initial hearings that you have for your client in a criminal defense case, is really opportunity for you to talk with the prosecuting attorney about maybe there might be some type of plea deal you can make. So I would go in dressed like I am now and began having conversations with the prosecuting attorney. And without fail, the attorney would ultimately, about 3 or 4 minutes into the conversation, say, "Is your client coming?" And I would have to just stop, and say, no, I'm the not your client coming, but is your attorney coming? And I would have to stop and say, no, I'm the attorney, several times, and sometimes to the same attorney, that they just, for whatever reason, what they saw when they saw me was not attorney, they saw client, criminal client. So fast forward about 8 years, not really having that problem anymore. I've corrected, or at least nicely helped people to know that they were being a little asinine. And then I was asked to, by one of my clients, to help prepare a witness. This was a different type of case. We weren't in the trial, but the client had a witness that they wanted prepared for had an employee that they wanted to be prepared for a witness in a trial. The day I did that, and then the day of the trial, they wanted me to go to the trial. I was not involved in the trial, I just prepared this witness. And I knew that the attorneys that were handling the trial were from certain law firms here in Kalamazoo. And so when I got to the court, one of a female attorney, or female person rather, came to me and basically said, "Hey, I'm at Miller, whatever the firm name was, and are you James Liggins?" I was like, "Yes, I am." It was a woman, and so I knew the name of the primary attorney on the file, and so I said, "Are you the paralegal on the file?" And as it turns out, this was a partner at this law firm. And so what I had this aha moment that I had this big issue with microaggressions against me, but I also have blind spots where instead of the victim of microaggressions, I'm the perpetrator. And so for me, it was an opening experience to realize, oh man, I got tons of work, tons of education to do, introspection to do for myself, because how can we help others to address a situation when we also ourselves have significant blind spots that we have ignored? I thought I was woke, right? As it turns out, I might have been woke on some things, but I was dead sleep on some other things. So I just throw that out as, for me, it was a watershed moment that caused me to really do some introspection.
I appreciate that story.
That's a great story. And I've heard many of Black attorneys specifically say how they've been confused to be the defendant on the case versus, the attorney. But it's Dr. Benson. I think you're going to add something.
Who, me?
Oh, I thought you wanted to add to his.
No, I'm just nice. I think the common thread there is also going back to, you have to educate yourself, because you can also commit them as well. So I think that that's important as well. So that was the only thing I was going to add.
And his response and sharing his story made me think about the invisibility factors that you discussed, right? It's like if I'm telling the same attorney over and over that I'm an attorney, it's like, do you even see me, right? You should remember me after the first time. And I myself as an attorney have had that, well, not exact same experience, but the experience of like, do you see me? Like, I've had a certain conversation with you. How do you not remember that we've had this conversation? So thank you so much for sharing that. So we have another question. When did you see yourself as belonging to the fields you are in, if at all? And what might we do as I'm thinking educators to create belonging in communities? So it's a two-part question. When did you see yourself as belonging to the fields you're in, and what can we do as educators to create belonging in the communities?
Dr. Benson?
Oh, I can go. I thought
Go
you
ahead.
were okay. Um, so I feel like I belong in whatever space I'm in, honestly. So I was reading an article recently by Ayanna Presley. They interviewed her and she said the same thing. And I think we have, as Black women in particular, we have to be resilient and we have to think about ourselves as we belong. If we're here, we belong here, and we deserve to be here. And so I think as an educator, and especially a DEI educator, I think more people think that lots of women do DEI in education when actually there's very few women of color who are in leadership positions, even in DEI work. But part of my role in thinking about creating belonging is you actually have to know your community. And I think that's something that I think we need to get back to. COVID has disrupted that. But I think that we have to make connections. How can you help somebody feel like they belong if you don't know who they are? And so I think that for me, that's a really key thing, understanding who actually makes up your community and realizing that everybody has different needs that are going to make them belong. Like sometimes it's just seeing people who look like you, and that makes you feel comfortable. Sometimes it's being able to have people who are interested in the same type of skill set or have the same type of hobbies, but you'll never know that if you don't actually have a conversation and dialogue with people. And I feel like in a world of technology, we feel like we know so much about people because we can go to Facebook, we can go to Instagram, but I really think that interpersonal human connection is what actually helps you figure out how people can be in a community. And a community doesn't mean everything's harmonious at all times. And so I think that's also a myth. We think that we're all going to get along, everything's great because we're all here. We have issues even within our racial and ethnic communities as well. But the thing is people should be able to find affinity. People should be able to find ways that they can be affirmed and have validation. And so I try to do that with my students. When they come into the college in James Madison Welcome Week, I always introduce myself as my key thing is for you to find something to be engaged in. It could be something that we have either promoted or invited you to, or it could be something even outside of Madison and the wider university. But the point is we want you engaged in something so you have a worthwhile college experience. But I also check in on people. I try to get to know my students. I advise student groups, but students share a lot with me and I try to check in with them. And I try to do that with my colleagues. If I know something about you, I try to reach out to you. I also try to provide support to you, but it all goes back to this idea of how we have interpersonal connections. You spend over 90,000 hours of your life at work. So I feel like you should try to have some type of connection to folks while you're there. I think if you're ever going to really have this, achieve this ideal of having community.
Dr. Benson is probably way more confident than I am. I say that a little bit flip, but no, let me explain where I come from. There's this concept of imposter syndrome in communities of color. And I'm a victim of that sometimes. I have to get myself out of it. So Kalamazoo's small. So of the attorneys who have passed bar exams, I've passed Michigan, Indiana, Illinois bar exams. I'm probably at the top level of attorneys that can say that here in Kalamazoo. Yet I still, and partner at law firm, I still have moments where I feel like, do I really belong here in the room, right? I still have moments where I'm like, and part of that, a big part of that is the worldview that has been imposed upon me. I probably have helped perpetuate that a little more myself too. but there is a worldview about whether or not we really belong at certain levels. And so I'm just being vulnerable here, and I struggle with that. I have moments where I'm just like, yeah, I know I can do it. Nobody can take away, the fact that I can practice law now, and nobody can do that. I'm in, right? But I still have moments where I'm like, well, maybe I shouldn't be here. Maybe I'm not as good as, I have those moments. I fight through them, right? I have moments. I mean, I got, the Lord has been good to me. I've been able to succeed in my life, but I have moments. And so as far as belonging in the field, in one sense of the word, once I passed those bar exams, I felt like, okay, I was there. But then experience kind of puts the fly in the ointment a little bit. And you realize that even though you're there, you've got a long way to go to get through some barriers and to succeed still, and to get to levels of success that you believe, or you see in other demographics. One clear example is that in my field, there is a built-in advantage to majority attorneys that come from affluent backgrounds or just middle-class backgrounds. And it's not that they get anything extra that I wouldn't, it's not that it's unfair. It's just that their parents have a business network that once you are an attorney, you can rely upon. One, that business network can help you get through to being an attorney. And then when you're there, you have kind of a ready base of clientele that can feed you work. And so now your numbers look really good versus little James Liggins' numbers, who's, my parents didn't have a network of business owners that they could say, hey, why don't you, consider using Johnny or James. So at the end of the day, there's just some barriers inherent that we have to kind of fight through as professionals of color. Now, again, I've been blessed in my career to being able to fight through some of those barriers, but I'll tell you, my career is a very unique animal, and like Dr. Benton, I've kind of had to make my own space, right? And show that there's value here, but there's a lot of fighting through insecurities as well.
You made an interesting point, because it's beyond, just gender and race. It's also class. Economic class, and I felt very similar to the way you felt in terms of class. Especially, I'm probate. I'm meeting people with millions and millions of dollars, and regular everyday attorneys. They're trust babies, and right. You're like, wow, you have this much money coming to you, and so I definitely understand. Understand.
I mean, most of my partners, and I'm telling on myself a little bit, have, at my level that are partners, they've got their little, cottages up north, and, and I'm just like, look, wait a minute, how did you get that again? I thought we were getting paid just about the same, So at the end of the day, they just start at a different level. They've got, an inheritance that they maybe got before, they just started, and okay, that's our lot. But I mean, at the end of the day, it's helpful to have those conversations so people know that we're not starting necessarily from equality. Yeah, we all, maybe we've got some similar equity, but we don't necessarily have equality if you get exactly the same based upon what I get and you already have, what you have. I don't know. It's not an easy conversation, but at the end of the day, it feeds back to me about community.
Absolutely. And when you end up in these spaces as, Black Americans, right, you end up in these spaces where you're the only one. You may have some people that support you, but it's also important to rub elbows with these individuals, right? Like, okay, I don't know this. I didn't grow up in this type of environment, but I'm going to take as much knowledge as I can from you in this particular situation so I can continue to learn how to build wealth or create wealth or whatever it is that you're interested in. So wonderful answers, wonderful questions. And so I want to thank everyone for their time. And I'm going to have, Ellen is actually going to join us. I want to thank the panelists again. This is wonderful. We can go on for 2 hours this evening because the answers and the questions were amazing. And so Ellen, it's her time to take over. Thank you again.
Well, thank you to every person that has graced us with your presence tonight and have made our lives richer for the conversation that has happened. So thank you, Mr. Liggins. Thank you, Dr. Benton, and thank you, Ms. Augustine, for your stories, your experiences, your expertise in these areas. And hopefully, if you are watching with us, you also will extend appreciation for the time and the space and the vulnerability, the stories of resilience that we have heard tonight. So in conclusion, I want to go back to something that Dr. Benton had said, which is that we choose to design our experiences around particular experiences or identities. And when we take the time to design our community and to focus on those who are perhaps most invisible in community, in society, that we create communities of inclusion because we are taking into account those most marginalized, and therefore it elevates all persons in society. And we hope and hang on to the hope that it is through civic education that we can raise that level of consciousness, and that we can provide opportunities for people to be authentic and real. And they might not like each other, but they will certainly respect the different cognitive conflict that can happen as a result of being honest and open about different ideas and experiences, and whatever we call this, democracy, marketplace of ideas that we have. So I want to thank you so much for joining us, and also thank Warner, Norcross, and Judd for underwriting this series. And as Ms. Augustine had said, we don't have to stop this conversation because we will pick up next month with the next community conversation. And I do want to thank Glenn Ellen as well, for making this possible. She's currently an intern with the Michigan Center for Civic Education, who's helping us organize this series as well. So thank you all. We look forward to seeing you next month as well. And the recording should be available, and we'll post that somewhere sometime soon. So if you want to share that, we would highly encourage you to do so. And also check us out at myciviced.org. Lots of opportunities to plug in, to volunteer. Thank you for a wonderful evening. Have a wonderful night.